Hey friends, it's Jessica from Three Rivers Homestead, and in today's video we are going to be doing a little Q&A. I put a question box up on Instagram asking for all of your questions about homestead related content specifically. And in the video description, all of the questions that I'm going to be answering have been divided into categories. I've put them down there for you with timestamps. So if you would like to kind of skip around and only view the categories, I guess, that interest you. For example, if you don't raise chickens and you want to skip that, you can skip it and just go to the gardening content, or you can just go to the food preservation content, things like that. So make sure you check out those timestamps. Like I said, I put a Q&A box on Instagram, and so I just kind of went through the most frequently asked questions, and we're going to cover those today. I'm going to try to be as succinct as I can be and not ramble too much, but you guys know I love to talk about homesteading, and I'm also a homeschool mom, so sometimes I get into like teacher mom mindset and I want to over explain things, so I'm switching off my homeschool mom hat. I'm just going to talk to you like we're having a conversation about homesteading today. But before we get started, I do want to thank the sponsor of this video, which is Backwoods Home Magazine. You guys have heard me talk about them many times. You may be wondering, how did I learn about homesteading? Well, it's publications like this that started me on my journey 15 years ago or so. We were living in the suburbs. We were dreaming about this life, and I was starting to learn everything that I could about canning and gardening and all of the things I wanted to do when we acquired our land one day. And this was a really helpful resource. So they are offering my viewers here 50% off an annual subscription to either Backwoods Home Magazine or their sister magazine, Self-Reliance Magazine. Make sure you check out the link in the description. This is an amazing deal. You get an entire year of the magazine for $13, which is such a deal, especially with the holidays coming up. This would be a great gift for someone in your life who's interested in the kind of content that I'm sharing here on my videos. And speaking of Q&As, every edition of Backwoods Home Magazine has a Q&A section with their expert, Jackie Clay Atkinson, and she talks about, I'm looking in this most recent Q&A, canning, ice houses, homemade biscuit powder, canning gravy, storage potatoes, beef tallow, all the kinds of things that I'm talking about on my channel. If you like my content, you're going to love this. That's why I'm so happy to partner with them and have them sponsor my videos, because I really think this is something that would add value to your homestead or your life right now if you're trying to learn about homesteading. So make sure you check out that link in the video description. But let's get started now with the Q&A. Like I said, skip around in the video description, check out the categories that you're interested in, but we are just going to go ahead and jump in and get started. Okay, here's a canning question. The question is, when do I retire jars from being used for canning? Well, that's a really good question, but canning jars do not go bad. The only way that I would retire a canning jar is if the rim of it were chipped in any way. That will prevent a good seal. Or if there were any little hairline cracks that I can see in the glass of the jar, then I would not use that again for canning because it is at risk of breaking. But otherwise, canning jars can be used forever. I'm going to post right here a picture of ball canning labels and as they've changed throughout the years. And I'm just showing this to show you how, if you wanted to look, if you've ever found antique canning jars or inherited some canning jars from old elderly friends or family members or something like that, based on the differences in that ball label, you can determine how old those jars are. And when I've done that, I have found jars in my collection that are as old as like 1920. So they're over 100 years old at this point and still being used in rotation here. Talk about a sustainable way to preserve food and not clutter our landfills. It's just amazing to me how this one glass jar can be used for 100 years if properly cared for and used properly. And think about the hundreds of disposable containers that would be in the landfill if you weren't using that jar for that food. It's just, man, it's just, talk about an eco-friendly option. So we don't retire jars, and I love finding old jars. There's just something in me, there's something exciting about knowing I'm canning with a jar that has been used for generations, and it makes me think about the many women's or men's hands that have touched that jar and fed their families with it. Just what a cool thing to have these antiques that are still usable. This is a good question, and I got it a lot through the growing season because I did a lot of preservation videos during my Every Bit Counts challenge, and you guys didn't see me using the freeze dryer. So the question is, am I still using a freeze dryer? Is it something that I would still recommend? Yes, I still have the freeze dryer, but unfortunately during the month of August, it was under repair. I had some issues with it during the month of July, and I was dealing with the technicians at Harvest Right and just didn't get a chance to get it repaired before the canning season begun. During that month of August, I don't have time to be repairing stuff. I'm just trying to process produce. So now that it is repaired, you might see me doing some preservation projects with it throughout the winter months, but otherwise, yes, I will be using that again. I love my freeze dryer. The reason I wasn't upset about not being able to use it this year is just because I have so much freeze-dried food in storage that I almost feel like I need to use some of that up before I continue to freeze dry more of it. So yes, I still highly recommend, if you're someone that preserves a lot of food, it's just great to have that other option. I love using a freeze dryer for herbs. I love it for powdering up eggs. I love it for leftovers. Like if we make something like spaghetti sauce or chili and we have just enough left over that it isn't enough for another meal for the whole family, but it's just enough for maybe a single or a double serving, throw it on a freeze dryer tray with the next batch, and you have like an MRE ready to go in your long-term food storage. So I love it for that. And I do know that they offer, in the month of November, I think that they do a sale around Black Friday that's pretty good on freeze dryer. So if that's something that you've been thinking about saving up for, check out the link in the description and check out their sales in the month of November, because you could get a really good deal on one this holiday season. The question is, what areas of homesteading are worth getting some training in versus trial and error? So I never think that it hurts to get a little mentorship or education in the things that you're doing. That never hurts. It's a great thing. In some areas of homesteading, I think having some education is absolutely necessary and crucial to success. And in some areas, I definitely think trial and error is a great way to learn, because no two experiences are necessarily going to be alike. So let's talk about the things that I recommend getting a little bit of training in first. The first thing that comes to mind is beekeeping. If you want to get into bees, definitely take a class. At the very minimum, get a book on beekeeping. Find some YouTube videos or something. That is not something that you want to jump into with zero understanding of how bees thrive, how a colony of bees works, the best practices for managing them, taking care of them, preventing things like mites and harvesting honey and all of that. There's just so much to know about beekeeping. I personally went to a neighboring county that has a beekeeping association and took a workshop with them. It was like an 8-hour workshop one day, and through that I was able to network with other local beekeepers that would serve as mentors for me if I had specific questions. I also connected through Instagram with people that are seasoned veteran beekeepers, and that was really important to me on my beekeeping journey. So do not use trial and error. It is too expensive, first of all, of a hobby. Investing in a nuke of bees is very expensive. For you to use trial and error and lose them all, it's going to cost you way too much money, on top of it's a very wasteful way to care for these little creatures. So educate yourself on that. Another thing that I would say is helpful would be canning. That is something that I wouldn't just jump into blindly. Like I wouldn't just start pressure canning with zero understanding of how canning works or how a canner works. I don't think you necessarily have to take like a workshop or a class on it, but at the very least, get yourself a good canning guide, like a Ball Blue Book or a Ball Guide to Preservation, and just learn the basic principles of canning, what makes it safe, what foods can be water bath canned versus pressure canned. And then for those first few years that you're canning, follow those tried and true and tested recipes. Don't just wing it and do the things that you want, because in that case, learning through trial by error could be deadly. I mean, you don't want to kill your family with botulism because you just decided to experiment with this new thing that you're learning about. So you definitely do want to educate yourself before you jump into that. Another thing that I would definitely advise you to at least learn a little bit about before you start would be butchering any kind of animal. Before I started butchering chickens, I didn't have a chance to get any kind of in-person experience with anybody. Adam did have some hunting experience with deer and things, but I mostly watched YouTube videos and was very grateful for the content that was out there. And I spent some time educating myself on that before I jumped in, because I didn't want to waste meat and mess up or cause the animals unnecessary pain. I wanted it to be as humane of a process as possible. And so learning how to butcher efficiently was part of that. So can you do all of those things without reading any books? Of course, but you're going to make some mistakes that are only going to harm the animals or potentially your family and cost you a lot of money. Okay, here's a question. It is, did you start out small, and advice on starting out small? And yes, absolutely. I will say that this is not because of me. If I'd have had my way, I was so excited to finally get to our property here that I would have jumped in head first and done it all, or tried to do it all in the first couple of years, and probably failed and burned myself out and given up. But thankfully, my husband is very pragmatic. He's just very logical, and he knew what I was already dealing with homeschooling kids, and I was pregnant the first, 6 months that we lived here, and he really helped to calm me down and make me start small and not add too many projects at once. So I'm very grateful for that now. So yes, we started small. And we kind of just took on maybe 1 or 2 projects every year, and we didn't add new stuff until we felt confident in that stuff. So that is my advice for you. Let's say you're moving to a brand new property and you're starting from scratch. I would say the best thing to focus on is saving up for infrastructure costs. The shelters that you're going to need to build for animals. Maybe you're going to need a barn. Maybe you're going to need a livestock trailer. Fencing is definitely a big cost that you need to consider. So really save up for that stuff. I would also say to make a 5-year plan and a 10-year plan and really map it out so that you can kind of spread those big costs over the years and not try to do it all at once and drain your savings or really put yourself in a bad place financially. My husband was very helpful in this, just drawing out a plan and being like, okay, starting with the beef, we're going to have these costs. So let's push that back a little bit to give us more time to save for it. Whereas maybe starting with the chickens, there's less of an upfront cost. So let's just go ahead and do that in the early years, and he just mapped it all out for me and made a plan. Another thing that I would say to do is not build any permanent structures on your property in those first couple of years, because it's going to take you a couple of years to figure out things like the drainage of your property and how the light reflects on the land. And I think about things like even planting fruit trees. We kind of waited a year or 2 before we did that, and I'm really glad that we did, because had we planted those fruit trees the very first year that we were here, they would have been out in our pasture where we ended up putting the beef eventually, because we had changed the configuration of where we wanted things on the property about 2 years after we were here. So take it slow. Just take it one project at a time. Once you feel like you financially recovered from the investment in that project, and you really have a good feel on the work and you can handle it, and you have space in your schedule to add a new project, then add something else. But the worst thing you can do is just do it all at once. And there is a really high rate of people who start homesteading and buy their property, invest in a bunch of stuff, and within 2 or 3 years they've given up and moved. And I firmly believe that in most of those cases, it's just they got in over their head and tried to do too much too fast. So there are plenty of years to grow a garden and to grow all your food one thing at a time, especially if you have young children, because they are the priority and you don't want to be taking too much time away from them building this homesteading dream. Okay, the question is, how do Adam and I handle large homestead expenses? Is this something we discuss beforehand, or do we just go get things as necessary, kind of without consulting each other because we know they're necessary for the project? So Adam and I, in all of our finances, whether it's homestead related or household maintenance or whatever, we do have a threshold, like a limit that both of us, if the purchase is going to reach that threshold, we will discuss the purchase with the other person. And that's just because we need to make sure that there are going to be enough funds available for that purchase. And, in maybe the next month for big purchases that are going to come up, it's just wise for us to sit down and make sure that making that big purchase isn't going to set us back and put us in a bad, place in the coming months. So whether it's homestead related or anything else, that is always the case for us. Now, we do have in our budget, we do have an area for homestead expenses, and we just make sure we're socking money away in that because we know every year that those expenses are going to come up. I've mentioned that we have like 5 and 10-year homestead plans, so we're actively saving in that budget for those projects that we're going to want to do in the next 5 years. But there's also emergencies that can come up where we're going to need, to use money. It could be, we had one year, where cows got sick and the medication for them was rather expensive. And so, when those kinds of things happen, you just want to make sure that you have kind of an emergency fund and you're not going to put yourself in a bad situation. So yes, all of those expenses are handled. We are not the kind of marriage where it would go over well if I or Adam just went out and bought some animals. Let's say if I showed up tomorrow and I said, Adam, a friend was getting rid of these pigs. I couldn't pass up the deal, so I brought them here and we're going to raise pigs now. And then it was up to him to come up with the money in our budget to build a shelter for them and to buy some fencing for them and all of the other things that we're going to need for raising them. That would not work well in our marriage for either of us. I wouldn't want him doing that to me. I wouldn't want to do that to him, not just financially, but also because I'm now putting work on his plate that he didn't necessarily anticipate, and it's going to mess up what he maybe had planned for the weekend to do for his projects. And I just think that's really unfair for me to choose to do a project that's going to burden him to help me complete, because I know I don't want him doing the same thing for me. My schedule's already very busy, so I don't want him surprising me with, hey, Jessica, by the way, I need you to today do this project for me instead of what you had planned. So there are no surprises here when it comes to purchases and projects that we're going to do. Everything is carefully thought out and planned, and I think that is just a good idea for your marriage, to just make sure everybody's on the same page. Okay, so here's a fun question. What's something that you started on the homestead and then regretted but didn't want to admit that you were wrong? If anyone has been here for a while and you've been following my beekeeping saga, that's the very obvious choice for this answer. I will say that I accumulated beekeeping gear for 3 years before I decided to finally pull the trigger and jump into it. And it was because I was very nervous to get started. It's a very intimidating thing, not just because you're dealing with a creature that could potentially sting you. That's not the scary thing about it. It's just that it's more complicated to me than other homesteading projects that are just easy. You know what I mean? Raising chickens is easy compared to keeping bees alive over the winter, or harvesting honey is just a whole lot more difficult than harvesting garlic from the garden, so there was a lot of intimidation. There's also a huge upfront cost. So I took 3 years to accumulate all of the equipment that I would need for beekeeping and to save the money to purchase the actual bees. And I finally in 2020 said, this is the year that I'm going to do it. I took a class, I read books, I felt as educated as I possibly could be jumping into it but I was also pregnant that year. I got the bees in like late April, and I had Benjamin in mid-June. So that's how pregnant I was, trying to like learn with these bees. And then I had a newborn that I'm trying to still learn my first year of beekeeping while taking care of a newborn. And I just did not devote the time and energy I needed to caring for those bees well in that first year. And Adam was not at all interested in beekeeping in my place. And none of the children were interested either, or old enough, I think, to take on that responsibility at the time in 2020. So we lost the bees through the first winter. I feel like just my fault on that, and just not having the time to devote to preparing them for winter as I should have. Then you guys will know that last year, so in 2023, I had an incident where there was a hole in my bee suit that I did not realize was there. It was in the veil, in like the bottom of the veil of my bee suit. And bees got in there, started stinging me. 2 bees were in there stinging me. I freaked out, pulled the hood off, and started to run away, not realizing that a swarm of bees was following me. And they stopped counting when they pulled out 40 stingers from me. I was stung so many times. It was awful. It took Adam with a hose to get the bees off of me and then get me to the hospital where they had to monitor me. I was swollen up. It was just a very terrible experience. And to be honest, I still, when I hear bees buzzing, don't react well to it. There's a lot of anxiety. And so I think I finally, I was ready to give up the bees, and because our hive died over the winter, because last year I didn't care for them again. And these were just wild swarms that had been moving into it since the original year that we lost our bees. So if a wild swarm moved in, I would just like care for them. And then they typically wouldn't survive the winter. So when they didn't survive last year, I said, okay, I'm getting rid of all my equipment. I have a friend that wanted to start beekeeping, and I was just going to gift all of this stuff to them. And then another swarm moved in, and I felt like, well, maybe this is God telling me that I need to overcome my fear and do it again. And I think I've just finally realized I'm going to admit that I was wrong. I am wrong. I am not a beekeeper at this season of my life. I would love to be a beekeeper. When we harvested honey, it was amazing. The years that we harvested honey, it was the best honey I've ever had. It was so worth it, and I loved it at that point. But I just don't think I'll ever feel the same working with the bees after the experience I went through. And 100% of the issues that I've ever had in beekeeping have been because I just haven't taken the time to learn. Even when I was stung by the bees, it was because I didn't take the time to double check my suit. I was rushing through the process and trying to get it done as quickly as possible, and that isn't something you can do with bees. So one day when my children are all raised and I'm at home just puttering around in my flower garden, maybe that would be a fun time to pick up the beekeeping again. But right now that is where I'm going to admit that I was wrong, and I'm done with it. What parts of homesteading do I love the most, and what parts are definitely a labor of love? I love canning food. I really do. I love food preservation. It's my favorite part about the whole cycle of growing food is canning it in jars and filling my pantry with it. As a mother, it just makes me feel so good to know that I'm providing all of this wonderful food and it's there and we could get through the winter with it. Working outside with my children, I love it. Whether we're planting garden seeds or we're caring for the animals together, I just get such peace in doing this work with the children by my side. It just feels right and it feels really good. The stuff that's a labor of love, I would definitely say garden maintenance is the hardest part of it all for me. Who enjoys weeding? I mean, I don't think I'm unique in that. I don't enjoy weeding. So like, I love planting the garden. I love planting the seeds. I love maintaining the garden until about midsummer when the weeds start coming in. And it's just like, I want to get to the fun part of preserving the food, but the maintaining it is definitely a labor of love that I have to like force myself to do. The other thing is butchering. Who loves butchering animals? Like butchering chickens is definitely a labor of love. I do it to steward the animals that we have well. You know, if we hatched them out and we have all these excess roosters, it is my duty to fix that problem and not just dump these roosters on someone else. And I also want to be able to feed my family this food. So I do it because I love my family and I want to care for the animals well, but it is definitely not not on the top of my list of things that I love to do. The question is, what is the best way to protect chickens from cold temperatures? Okay, so we live in Ohio. We do have cold winters here. It can drop below freezing. Typically the months of January and February are our coldest. Some years it might get down well below zero for several weeks. A lot of times it might hang out right around that freezing temperature, but I wouldn't say that our winters are terrible compared to some other areas of the country. But the thing I will say about our chickens is that they're just very acclimated to the weather. They get acclimated to the weather as the temperatures begin to drop. The best advice that I was ever given in getting started with chickens in Ohio was just to make sure that I was getting the right breeds. Not every chicken breed is going to thrive in a wintry environment. I find that things like Barred Rocks, Buff Orpington, Rhode Island Red, Black Jersey Giants, Americanas, I'm trying to think of what else. All of those do really well in our winters. The worst bird I've ever had for winters was probably a leghorn. We've had white leghorns and brown leghorns, and I think what it is their combs are just so tall that they're really susceptible to frostbite. That makes them very uncomfortable in the winters. So typically the breeds with shorter combs and larger, heavier bodies tend to do better during the winter than the skinnier chickens with the larger combs, even though those skinny chickens are better for egg laying purposes. So choose the right breed. That would be my first bit of advice for winters. My second bit of advice, a lot of people think, okay, it's winter, it's very cold out, I am going to insulate my chicken's entire coop, and I'm just gonna make sure that there's no cold air that can get in there and they'll be nice and toasty and warm. And that is probably the worst thing you can do for your chickens in the winter, because they spend a lot of time in the coop, and all of that respiration produces moisture inside the coop. And if there isn't a lot of ventilation, that moisture will make the air colder, like a wet cold inside the coop, and make them more susceptible to respiratory issues and also to frostbite. So it is really important. You can, like, we like to stack some straw bales we'll put up on the western side of the coops, because that's where the wind comes from in the winter. And that creates a little bit of a wind barrier, but we do leave ventilation. We have some holes in the coops and some area that's kind of open near the top. But we want to get that cross breeze in there to allow that humidity to escape. Another thing that we do in the winters is we do feed them outside. We feed them a lot of protein to keep them busy, but we do want to make sure that they're getting out of the coop every day. I know a lot of people will feed them inside the coop to keep them in there where it's warm, but I just find that they're more susceptible to disease and illness and things in the winter when they don't get outside in the fresh air. And a lot of times they'll be chicken, pun intended, in those first couple snows, and they're not going to want to step out there to get their feed, but if they get hungry enough, they'll want to come out there and they'll get used to it and get acclimated to the weather and be out there just fine. Some people supplement with heat lamps or with artificial light in the winter to keep their chickens laying through the winter season and to keep them a little more warm. We choose not to do a heat lamp just for fire safety reasons, and we choose not to do artificial light just to give our girls a little bit of a laying break through those winter months. So they'll slow down in egg production usually about all of December, all of January, and they'll pick up at some point in February. The next question is, have you considered raising other bird species like turkeys, geese, or guineas? So we currently have chickens, and we raise them both for eggs and meat, and we have ducks. They're primarily Pekin and Rouen ducks. They're kind of dual purpose. Excuse me, they're great egg layers, but they also provide a good meat source. In terms of other species of birds, we have done guineas before. What I like to say about guineas is it's like they almost try to die. They don't last very long here. The way our chicken runs are, they butt up against the edge of our property, and next to it is a cornfield. And the guineas just don't like to go into the coop at night. They end up roosting up in the trees, and they're very flighty and light, even if you clip their feathers. So they would a lot of times end up coming out of the trees on the other side of the fence where our livestock guardians can't protect them, and they would end up out in the cornfield and go missing. So we've never had guineas make it longer than a year on our property before they end up not making it. So that is, we just chose never to do it again. We wanted the guineas to work, so they're really good at eating ticks, and we have a lot of ticks on our property, but we can't seem to keep them alive. Whereas our chickens and ducks, we have no issues with them trying to hop the fence or fly away or anything like that. Turkeys we haven't considered because Adam and I, it's just not our favorite type of meat. We eat turkey at Thanksgiving every year, but I find turkey to taste kind of dry. It's just not my favorite poultry, so I don't want to use growing space on the property for that. Guinea, or what were the other one? Yeah, no, geese. Geese were the other suggestion, and I've heard they can be really mean. I have some friends that have had experiences with them, like attacking the small children. Just not something I wanted to deal with when we're already doing ducks, and I don't know. I don't think I've actually ever eaten goose in my life. So maybe someday we'll try it when all the kids are a little older and can hold their own, but for now I don't want geese attacking the kids. So that's why we haven't done that. But we do really enjoy chickens and ducks. I would say out of the two, I enjoy raising chickens more than I do ducks for several reasons that maybe I'll get into later. But yeah, for now, that's enough for our poultry needs. Okay, the question is, do you raise your own chickens for processing? What breed, and how is the meat versus store meat? So we do raise our own chickens. We do a mix. Usually every year when I go to the feed store, if they have chicks that are like 50 cents a piece that are on sale, I'll pick up maybe 6 to 8 of them to bring home just so we can add some new genetics to our flock. But for the most part, we are hatching. We have an incubator and we just hatch our own chickens from our flock, and that's how we raise new chickens as the old ones pass away, or as we harvest the older hens as they reach the end of their productive egg-laying seasons. So at this point, our flock is a very mixed, there's a lot of mixed breeds in there. We started out our first year with a lot of barred rocks, Rhode Island Reds, Easter Eggers, Black Jersey Giants, and then we kept some, we had some Buff Orpingtons, and we kept some roosters that were, what is the name? That were actually meat birds, that were kind of a slow growing meat bird, because our goal was to breed a meat bird rooster with an egg laying hen, and to see if we could get like a larger egg layer that would be productive and a great dual purpose bird. Obviously these like crossbreed meat roosters don't breed true, but they were extremely fertile and they produced some amazing looking chickens, but we don't exactly know what breed they are because they were like hybrids to begin with. But anyways, we have this great flock, and a lot of it is like 5th or 6th generation on our property now, and that is our primary way that we raise meat. I like to just every year hatch out a couple batches of eggs. We keep any of the new females to add to our egg-laying flock, and all of the males are butchered for meat. Most of that meat is canned for a lot of my like soups and things. There are years that we'll do meat birds like Cornish cross or other varieties, and we somewhat enjoy that if we do small batches of them, but Adam doesn't prefer the taste of store-bought or even homegrown like Cornish cross meat. He finds that really white meat to be rather dry. He prefers a dark meat, and I find that the taste of the young roosters that we hatch out that aren't those hybrid meat birds, the taste is very different. It tastes like a dark meat. It has a lot of flavor and it's juicier. So since he prefers that, we just tend to skip. If there's a year where I'm not pregnant or I don't have a newborn, we might do meat birds, but otherwise it's just one of those tasks that we choose not to do, and then we just eat less chicken those years. Okay, the question is, are chickens or cows easier to start with? So I guess to clarify this, the question didn't ask easier in terms of what. Are we talking about easier in terms of just the amount of work that it takes to take care of these animals, or easier financially to get started? Because those are two very different questions that I'm going to give you different answers for. But let's just talk about the amount of work that it takes to care for the animals on a daily basis. Cows are infinitely easier than chickens, in my opinion. Daily chore wise, let's say in the winter when we do have to supplement with hay, we only have to put hay out maybe once every couple of weeks if we're doing a large round bale. We have a very large trough that we fill up for their water, and we can fill that maybe once every 3 days or so. When it does drop below freezing, the hardest part of caring for cows is to go out and break up their water, make sure they have access to fresh water that isn't frozen over. But on a summer day when we don't have to worry about freezing and we don't even have to supplement with hay, they're just out on pasture, it's literally just going out and checking on them and making sure they're okay. And so it takes you very little time as compared to something like chickens. On a daily basis, chickens are a little more work. You have to collect the eggs. You have to feed them actual feed. They can't just, necessarily live off the pasture unless you have them free ranging on your property where their diet consists solely of bugs or something like that. And you do have to water them. If it's winter, it's going to require you to water them more frequently. Just like I mentioned with the cows, their waters will freeze over, so you have to go out and do that. And every time you go out to check their water, you're going to need to collect eggs because the eggs could freeze if it drops below freezing. So you're going to be collecting eggs, maybe 3 or 4 times a day throughout the winter months. And then there is the maintenance of their coops. Chickens are a lot dirtier. They spend more time in their coops. So you're going to have to clean that out on a consistent basis, which is going to take a lot of your time. Whereas our beef that we keep out on pasture, they do have access to a shelter. But I have only seen them probably in the last year, maybe 2 or 3 times even go in the shelter. It's only when there's a storm coming. Otherwise, they're not in there, so we don't really have to clean it out very often. So chickens take more time out of your day. Chicken chores might take us 20 minutes in the morning and another maybe 15 minutes in the afternoon. The cow chores in the height of summer may only take us 5 minutes just to walk out to the pasture and make sure everything's okay. When things go wrong with cattle, it's definitely a bigger hassle. It's a lot more work. If you go out there and one of your beef or your cow, they're sick, it's going to require a lot more. You might have to call in a vet to help you with their issues. The medication is a lot more expensive for them. Whereas chickens tend to, when they have health complications, it's the same issues. It's the same type of treatment. It's a lot easier. They're easy to pick up and handle and do things like that. Cost-wise, it definitely is easier financially to start with chickens. They just need a coop. That's probably the hardest part about getting started with them. You can use like electric poultry netting. You don't even need really that strong of fences. And their waterers and feeders can be very simple and cheap. So your startup cost with them is very minimal. Whereas getting started with beef, you're going to need stronger, more secure fences. Because if they escape, it can be a big problem. So you're going to want to have, and they're going to need more fencing because they're going to need a much larger area to live in than something like chickens. Other startup costs, the cost of shelters for both of them are similar. I would say that like cow feeders and waters are a little more expensive when you're starting out, but you do get more bang for your buck. Raising beef, I feel like, is a whole lot more profitable than raising chickens. Sometimes when I calculate what we save in raising our own chickens for eggs specifically, it's kind of a wash. We're not really making any money on it. Whereas the beef, definitely raising the beef does save us money. So all that considered, if I were brand new to homesteading and I had a lot of money to invest in a startup project, I would get started with beef right away. It's just going to save you a lot of money in the long run. But if money were a factor and I had more time for chores in a given day, I would start up with the chickens because you have less of a financial investment. They could be moved around on the property to different places. So yeah, not a very clear answer, but I hope that helps. Okay, so the question is, do I ever feel attached to an animal and I can't butcher it or eat it? I honestly have never had that issue. Every animal that I'm raising for protein on this property is potentially, I already have the mindset when I'm caring for them that they could potentially end up on my plate. So I just view them as differently than I do like my pets. They aren't my pets. I don't bond with them in the way that I do like my dogs or our indoor cat, the way I bonded with that. They are livestock to me. Now my children have had like specific hens that have been their favorite or something like that. And particularly the younger children will have an attachment to them. And I found this the early years of homesteading when we were getting used to raising animals. They'd have an old hen that would like die, and they would have been traumatized if they knew that ended up on their plate. And so we would bury those chickens for the children's sake. But now it's like, like the first heifer that we ever raised for beef, I had no problem eating it because I was just excited to have our homegrown beef. I did have children that had a problem eating that beef. For about a month after butchering, they wouldn't touch beef, and they said they never wanted to eat beef again. And then after a month, the memory would wear off, and they'd see us eating hamburgers, and they would join back in. So, and honestly, that was only for the first year and a half that we were raising beef. After that, at this point, it's a non-issue. I haven't had a kid refuse to eat meat after butchering in the last couple of years. So, no, I haven't had that issue. I think it's just the mindset that you have to have. It's not a pet. Its purpose is to nourish the family, and so I feel like it would be wasteful for me not to use it for that purpose. Like the old hens that I just buried for the children's sake, it just felt like such a waste to me. Like what a waste of their life to not fulfill the purpose of ending up on the plate, but I did it for my kids' sake. How do we care for cows and hay without a tractor? This must be someone who's been watching for a while, and they know that we didn't get our tractor until 2022, late 2022, maybe early 2023. I'm trying to remember. So we cared for beef on our property for several years before the tractor came here. And to be honest, it was a little more physical work for Adam and the boys, but it was totally doable. So the main reason we need the tractor to care for the cows is to move the large round bales that we have around the property. So before we had the tractor, what Adam would have to do is back up the trailer with the round bales in it onto one side of our property. Unfortunately, he couldn't drive the truck or the tractor across all the way to where the pastures were because in the winter when the cows are eating the hay, often the ground is muddy and we didn't want, the trucks to get stuck or to tear up the yard and stuff. So they would literally like drop the round bales on one side of the property, and Adam and the two boys would have to roll it, like physically push it, and the three of them together could roll that round bale out to the pasture and get it out there. It was, like I said, much more labor intensive and took a lot more time than now that we have the tractor. We have like the spike on the back of the tractor that they can just poke that round bale, pick it up, carry it out there, and it takes, a couple minutes versus all the effort to roll it. But it is totally doable because honestly, that was the only daily or weekly maintenance chore that required the use of the tractor at the time. But for us, the reason why we finally did get the tractor was because we had, if you guys will remember, the year where we lost 3 calves in a row. This was due to the place we were sourcing the calves from. They were having a problem that year with selling sick calves to people. So we would get the calves here, and within a week of being on the property, they would die. We've never had that problem before using that person to source the cows, and we have never had that problem since. So we've determined that all evidence points to it was these cows were sick coming onto our property. But my point in bringing this up was that when you go outside in the morning to discover a rigor mortis calf that weighs, that weighed 400 pounds or 300 pounds before it died and now is just dead weight, not having a tractor to first of all help you move that animal out of the pasture, but also a tractor to help you dig up the place to bury that. Unfortunately, our property isn't large enough to just toss the animal onto like the back acreage to let nature take care of, that carcass for us. We didn't have the option to just like put that on the curb and have trash pick it up. So we had this large animal and we're like, what are we going to do with it? And we needed to dig a pit on our property to put the calf. And by the time the third calf died, and we had to call our neighbor down the road, and he's such a kind man. He was more than willing to come and bring his tractor down and help us dig these holes. But it felt like, it would be a lot more convenient for us to have the equipment to do this ourselves versus having to burden other people with that work 3 times in a row. And so we saved up, and that was an important purchase for us, was to get the tractor for those reasons. So now we have it for moving hay, and we have it for if we ever run into an issue where we have a large animal that needs to be moved as dead weight, a tractor is going to be really helpful for that. Have we ever considered meat rabbits? Yes, we have. Honestly, if I were going to take on another protein related project on our homestead, meat rabbits would be the next thing that I would do. I think the reason I haven't jumped into it is because Adam and the boys hunt a lot in the winters, and they get wild rabbits and they'll bring them home. And of course those rabbits are already deceased when they get here, but I don't like processing them. They're just not my favorite. And so I just know that like that isn't something, the butchering process of the rabbits isn't something that I would necessarily enjoy. Like I would do it if I had to, but I think that's what has kept me from jumping into it. But the reason I really would like to get into meat rabbits is honestly for the manure source. Now that we have the raised beds, I find myself needing to amend my beds and fertilize the garden beds a lot more. And rabbit manure is one of those things that you can just toss into your garden beds hot. It doesn't need the time to break down and compost like your cow manure or your chicken manure, things like that would need to be. And so I think that is the main reason, it would be for the meat, and it would also be for the manure that the rabbits could provide us. Okay, here's one. It is, where are you at on the balance between growing meat versus growing fruits and vegetables? If we're on a scale, I am definitely heavier on the growing meat and protein at this point. I just think in the season of life that I'm in, it takes way less time than growing fruits and vegetables. Also, have you seen the cost of meat in the grocery stores lately? I feel like in terms of the amount of effort and money that we invest into projects on the property, we get more bang for our buck with growing things like beef or growing our own meat sources, just because it saves us money compared to what we would get of equal quality in the grocery store. Whereas with fruits and vegetables, I have a lot of contacts locally, like other farmer friends that grow fruits and vegetables and sell them fresh at farmers markets for very reasonable prices, where it's a lot easier to purchase from them and maybe preserve it. And I'm not, whereas growing it myself doesn't save me as much money as it does with the meat, if that makes sense. I feel like because we're a smaller homestead too, we are, around 4 acres, that space is very limited, and I get more bang for my buck in terms of like square footage growing protein versus growing fruits and vegetables. Now, the exception to that, I will say, is like fruit trees. They take up very little space on your property and they yield a lot of produce for you. So I think investing in as many fruit trees as possible on our property is just a really good thing. There's very minimal maintenance on keeping up with the fruit trees compared to a veggie garden or things like that. So I will always prioritize the protein sources and the fruit trees over my actual garden. And you guys have seen that over the years as my garden size has shrunk down. We still have a rather large garden, but it's definitely not enough to meet all of our produce needs for the whole year. And that's just because I have really good alternatives for getting healthy, organic, local produce at an affordable price. It's just not an option for me with meat as much, so we choose to focus our energy on that. Okay, the question here is tips for putting the garden to bed for the winter. And I'm just going to be completely honest with you on this. I'm the last person you should be asking for advice on this because I'd say about 75% of the time I do not put my garden to bed for the winter. I have mentioned this before in videos that I justify it because I've read before that leaving your dead plants out in the winter provides spaces for pollinators to nest, leaving your leaf litter out there, even leaving like weeds and things that have kind of hardened a lot of pests that are beneficial, like let's say a praying mantis, for example. They lay their egg cases sometimes on the hard stalks of dried, dead plants and things like that. And if you go and you remove all of that, you're removing their habitat. Some pollinators, they'll cocoon and they'll kind of dig into the soil underneath your plants. And so they do say it's best for the pollinators to leave all of that vegetation there for them over the winter. And then once everything thaws in the spring, they've had a chance to thaw and emerge, and then you remove all of that. So that's how I justify my lack of effort on putting things to bed for the winter. And it's just, honestly, I am usually so burnt out from canning season and starting school up in September that by October and November, when I need to be putting the garden to bed, I just have nothing left. And so I just figure it'll be next spring's problem. And what's funny is that usually in the springtime, I'm so ready to get out into the garden. I have all this gung-ho energy from being cooped up all winter that I don't mind doing all of that cleanup work. It's exciting for me to do that in the spring. So that just seems to serve me well. And I tell myself it's good for the pollinators. So how do I keep pests from ruining my garden? This is a good story here, kind of a long story I'm going to tell you about the history of pests on my property. And there's a lesson to be learned in this that I think will answer the question. So the first year we moved here, there were very few pests. We noticed that there were a lot of birds. It was just great. And I'm gardening, and I'd say maybe the first year and a half, it was sort of like that. And then these barn cats started to accumulate, like feral cats. I think they figured out that we lived here, and I don't know, they just descended on the property, all of these cats. And this was before we had our livestock guardians. And in that year where the feral cats were kind of really around a lot, the bird population declined drastically. And that following summer, the pest load was so bad, and I truly believe that it was because the birds weren't here to control it for us. The bird population was decimated, and so we had Japanese beetles that year destroyed all of our grapevines. They killed 2 really large trees just by eating all of the leaves. All of the beans that I grew that year were just laced with holes from the Japanese beetles, and the tomato hornworms were just out of control that year. I would go out and I would pick 20 of them, it felt like, every night with my black light flashlight, just out of control. And then the next year we got our livestock guardians, and our dog Leela literally hates cats to the point where she chased all of them away and will not let them back on the property. Once she chased the cats away, the birds came back. And once again, once the birds were here, no issues with Japanese beetles, No issues with tomato hornworms. It's like they really do a good job. And we've gone to great lengths to encourage birds to be on our property. We are in rural Ohio where we are surrounded by cornfields and bean fields. And we are like this little oasis for the birds in the middle of all that. There's like 4 acres of just berry trees. We have multiple, like 4 bluebird houses, bird baths, bird feeders everywhere. Tons of trees for them to nest in. There are birds just all over the place. So that is how we control most of the pests in our garden, is just the birds do it for us. Now, the problem though, with not having the cats on the property is, yes, the birds do a great job with the insect pests, but now we have a rodent problem. So like voles and moles and mice and things like that want to get into your garden and eat your seed and nibble on things. Like when the cats went away, that then became a problem. So it's like, oh, we can't win. It's one thing. It's either the insects or the rodents. In an ideal world, like our dogs would let a couple cats be on the property to help with the rodents. And they would leave the birds alone so that there would be enough, to control the pest population. But I feel like we can't have both right now. So that was one of the reasons that I moved to raised beds. We had such a vole problem the last year that I did in-ground gardening. The voles ate every pea and bean seed that I planted. They tunneled through my whole garden and would just destroy roots of plants and nibble stuff up. It was a disaster, and I said, I'm not going to invest time into my garden like this anymore to have this be the result. And so I read a lot about doing raised beds, and we lined them all with 1/4-inch hardware cloth so that the voles couldn't tunnel up through, and that has not been a problem anymore. We do end up having to set a few traps in the garden for mice and things, but otherwise that, since we don't have the cats, which would be the best way to keep the rodents away, the raised beds with the hardware cloth have been extremely helpful. I will say that even with the birds, there are a couple pests that the birds don't seem to affect at all. One of them is the squash bugs, and I found the best deterrent for them is just to plant varieties of squash that are resistant to the bugs. This year we did Canada crookneck. It was recommended by a friend, and it worked great. Squash bugs completely left those alone. Another thing is planting your things like zucchini later in the season. Because those squash bugs do have kind of like a life cycle. Plant some trap crops in the beginning of the year, let the cycle run out, and then by the time you go to plant your zucchini closer to fall, they won't bother those plants as much. So that is really helpful for us too. The other pests that the birds don't seem to help with are the cabbage moths. And the only effective way that I found that doesn't require spraying or anything like that is using netting. This year we used netting on our brassicas for the first time, and the cabbage moths were much less of a problem. So that's all the advice that I really have. Encourage birds on your property. Try to keep the rodents away through cats, but make sure you balance the cat population so they don't kill all your birds. Use netting, and make sure you're planting varieties that might be resistant to those pests. Okay, friends, I hope you enjoyed this little Q&A on all homesteading related topics. I am by no means an expert. I've just been at this for almost a decade here on this property. I've been canning and preserving food for longer than that, maybe 18 years. And so I just like to share some of the trial by error knowledge that I've gained with you guys in the hopes that it can help somebody out there. But if you're looking for some more expert advice, definitely make sure you check out the sponsor of this video, Backwoods Home Magazine. As I mentioned in the beginning, there's a great Q&A section in every magazine. So if you like this kind of Q&A content, you can find some of that here from someone who has been providing advice like that for over 25 years for the magazine. So she really knows what she's talking about. I think you're going to love this. Check out the link in the video description to get 50% off of a yearly subscription to Backwoods Home Magazine or their sister magazine, Self-Reliance. The difference between the two, Backwoods Home Magazine has been around for over 35 years. It deals with all homestead-related content. animal husbandry, hunting, butchering, all of those kinds of topics. Whereas if those are things that you're not interested in, or that maybe you don't, maybe you're a vegetarian or a vegan and you're not interested in that kind of content, but you still want homesteading content about gardening and other aspects of self-sufficiency, self-reliance, magazine is going to be more up your alley. So you have two options. Just want to thank them again for sponsoring the video, and thank you guys for being here. I will be back next week with one of my more typical videos, sharing what we're doing in the kitchen and around the homestead. But for this week, I just needed to do a Q&A for you guys because I was having some pregnancy exhaustion this week and wasn't able to get to the actual projects that I was planning to do for this week's video. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this in place of that, and you're having a great week. I'll see you next week, friends. Bye.